This segment covers the diplomatic roles and powers of the presidency as articulated in the Constitution, also as has developed over time according to convention. Presidents have very significant powers in the diplomatic realm, many of which are not really specifically articulated in the Constitution. You probably have seen this picture before, or some version of it. This is John F. Kennedy addressing the crowd at the Brandenburg Gate in West Berlin, Germany in 1963. This is where he gave the famous speech where he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner." He actually pronounced it incorrectly. He was trying to say, "I am a Berliner." Instead, I think it literally came out in German as, "I am a jelly donut." But the crowd actually got the point, and it was a particularly popular speech. So, one thing that makes our system somewhat unique in comparison to, say, Great Britain, the United States President is both the head of the government and the head of state, and those roles are separate in most other countries. For example, in the UK, the head of state is Queen Elizabeth II. She's the symbolic head of state, whereas the Prime Minister is the head of the government. So we don't separate those roles in the United States. The President serves as both. They're both the symbolic head of the United States government and the actual head of the United States government. And that's important. If you think about it, the Queen in England, for example, is kind of able to float above the fray of politics and present herself as a symbol of national unity, whereas the Prime Minister is tasked with the nitty-gritty of governance. But in our system, we ask the President to carry out both those roles, and sometimes that can be somewhat problematic. Now, what does the Constitution say? The President is given the responsibility of receiving ambassadors and other public ministers, and that has been interpreted over time as indicating that the President has the sole power to give diplomatic recognition to another country. So, for example, President Obama would have the power to receive an ambassador and another public minister from Cuba tomorrow, technically. I think politically it'd be very difficult for a number of reasons, but ultimately the authority over recognition of a country lies with the presidency. And, the president also serves as the face of the United States abroad in a way that any individual member of Congress is really unable to do. These are some interesting moments in 20th century American diplomatic history. This, of course, is Richard Nixon's famous visit to China in 1972, which led to the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between the People's Republic of China and the United States by 1979 during the presidency of Jimmy Carter. This is an interesting one as well. It may be difficult to tell from this particular picture, but this is Emperor Hirohito of Japan, who happened to be emperor at the time World War II commenced in 1941 between the United States and Japan. This is a picture of him with Richard Nixon. Hirohito became an important American ally, and he actually reigned in Japan until 1989, so quite a lengthy period of time. So he went from a significant adversary of the United States during the war to a significant ally in the decades thereafter. This picture here in the upper right-hand corner was taken in 1976. This is President Gerald Ford and Queen Elizabeth II of England. They are toasting the bicentennial of the United States in 1976, the 200th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, so clearly Queen Elizabeth has gotten over it. It's good for everybody. And perhaps one of the most famous diplomatic ventures of the late 20th century, this is President Jimmy Carter. This is Prime Minister Begin of Israel, and this is President Anwar Sadat of Egypt, and Jimmy Carter was instrumental in helping to negotiate a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, who had been technically at war since 1948 and fought several military conflicts, and Carter was able to negotiate Egyptian recognition of Israel, so Egypt became the first Arab state in the region to give diplomatic recognition to Israel. And there have obviously been many ups and downs in that relationship over the years, but they have never broken diplomatic relations. Some additional moments in presidential diplomatic history in the 1980s. One of the most important relationships Reagan fostered during his presidency was with Pope John Paul II. Reagan, as you certainly know, was a significant anti-communist figure. He was a serious adversary of the Soviet political system. Pope John Paul had been Archbishop of Krakow in Poland previously. He also was a significant adversary of the communist system of government, and even though Stalin famously said that the Pope has no military divisions, the Pope does have significant symbolic power, and the alliance of sorts between these two figures was a very significant threat to Soviet influence in Eastern Europe during the 1980s. This picture was taken at the White House in 1993. This is President Bill Clinton with Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and the chairman of the PLO, Yasser Arafat. Clinton worked to negotiate a similar deal to the Egyptian-Israeli deal of 1979, where the Palestinian Authority, limited governing entity, was created in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. In exchange, the Palestinian Liberation Organization gave up its stated goal of removing the state of Israel from the region, and it's interesting to see what would have happened if Yitzhak Rabin had lived. He was assassinated in 1995 by a extremist Jewish settler, and things became difficult after that. But this was a very dramatic moment, and Clinton obviously knew it. You could tell how he very consciously is framing this photograph for maximum effect, and this photograph has been reproduced many, many times. This isn't a picture of a diplomatic venture per se, but this is a picture of future President George H.W. Bush serving as American ambassador to the United Nations in the 1970s. Probably no president was better prepared for the diplomatic aspects of the presidency than George H.W. Bush. If you think about his positions, he was extremely well prepared to be president. He was a member of the House of Representatives for a time. He was our first ambassador to the People's Republic of China. He was our ambassador to the United Nations. He later served as the head of the Central Intelligence Agency for a year, a position that he did not like, or he did not want at first, but then came to quite enjoy the position. He served as vice president for 8 years under Ronald Reagan, and then of course a term of his own as president. It'd be interesting to see what George W. Bush's foreign policy would have been like had there been no 9/11 or Iraq War, but he also had some significant diplomatic achievements. He went out of his way to improve relations with India. During his presidency, India is the world's largest democracy. Our relations with them have been strained for quite a long time for a number of reasons. One, India was an ally of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, or they were a bit more closely aligned with the Soviets than the Americans. Their illegal nuclear testing in the late 1990s also led to a degree of sanctions from the United States, but Bush went out of his way to try to foster better relations with the Indian subcontinent, and India in particular. And President Obama's presidency has been focused actually on many things in terms of foreign policy. This is a picture of President Obama welcoming the new president of China to the White House. He has worked very hard to attempt to foster relations with them, which is obviously challenging, and it's a challenge that has faced many presidents since the late 1970s. Some other diplomatic powers of the presidency. Okay. The president negotiates treaties and submits them to the Senate for advice and consent to ratification. And that consent requires 2/3 of the senators to agree. The practice during George Washington's presidency was that he would actually show up to the Senate to consult with them about the treaty, but that proved so inefficient that was quickly abandoned, and from that point forward, presidents simply negotiate the treaties and submit them for an up or down vote to the Senate. One of the challenges, though, is that you may need the House of Representatives to get involved if you need additional domestic legislation to give the treaty effect in U.S. law. Okay. Actually, treaties are increasingly rare today. Presidents are more likely to resort to something called an executive agreement. And there's a few different types. There are some agreements that are called sole executive agreements. Okay? And they are conducted and concluded with essentially no congressional input. Two examples of this are the agreement ending the war in Vietnam and the agreement ending the Iran hostage crisis. Okay? And these types of agreements are conducted under what's called the president's plenary powers, like, for example, any agreement that derives from the president's authority as commander-in-chief, for example, doesn't necessarily need the influence of Congress. Most executive agreements, though, are called congressional executive agreements. They're either authorized in advance by the Congress or they're approved afterwards as a piece of legislation. Probably the most famous example of this in the recent years is the North American Free Trade Agreement. Okay. They decided to submit that agreement as simply a piece of legislation rather than as a trade agreement, partly for the reason that all you needed was a majority in the House and the Senate rather than 2/3 of the Senate to agree. Okay. For example, as I said before, one of the most famous executive agreements of recent years was Nixon's agreement to end the war in Vietnam, and that was concluded without the input or participation of the Congress.